So recently, famous funk/jazz guitarist Cory Wong divided the guitar community with the following statement while showing an exercise on Instagram. If you can't play a C on every string, you're not an advanced guitarist. Now, let's start by saying that I don't disagree with the overall message that you need some knowledge of the fretboard and which note you're playing. It reminds me of something similar that Satriani said along the lines of, if you don't hear it in your head first, you shouldn't play it. And again, I like the general message of not mindlessly following scale patterns and running up pentatonic scales without purpose. But I think those particular pieces of advice or comments are a bit disingenuous, and especially coming from guitar players. And I will explain why. So, the whole point of learning a skill is creating automatism so that you don't have to think about the tiny details and all the excruciating little movements anymore. At some point, you don't think about this anymore. You can make the analogy with learning to drive. At some point, you don't think about what you're doing with the blinkers consciously. You automatically do it. And if you drive manual, you'll know that after a while you don't think about which gear you're on. You just feel the engine, feel the response, the noise, etc. And you just know when it's the right time to shift. It's the same also with learning to read. When you are a child, you learn how to spell individual letters and how they form words. And as you get better, you just decipher entire words without consciously thinking about which letters make them up. And I think it's very similar with music. And then I think an even more speaking analogy for me would be doing some math. Here we have the following little operation. If you're really familiar with it, it's quite trivial, but what's happening here when I'm doing this 10 to the power of 2 times 10 to the power of 3? It means that I have to multiply 10 by 10 to get that first power of 2, and then multiply that by 3 times more. I do the operations 3 times more, but the multiplication is itself a repetition of an addition. So ultimately, I add 10 to each other 10,000 times. Yeah, but most people who are quite familiar with such calculations, they don't think like that. They just see the 2 and the 3 and say, well, the result is 10 to the power of 5, because they've encapsulated these ideas of multiplications and additions and the fact that you can do them recursively. And yeah, I want to argue that it's very similar for scales and chords. We first learn about notes and then we punch them up into chords and scales. But it's completely okay to play a chord or play a scale without knowing what's in it. So yeah, it's better if you do. You can make more interesting voicings if you know how to decompose the chord. You can find more comfortable fingerings that are more logical for the piece you want to play. You can choose which register of the neck you want to play in. But even then, to be able to do that, you don't need to know every single note. You need to know where the key elements are. Where's the root, where's the fifth, where's the third, and any other coloring tones. But you don't need to know the whole thing. And yeah, learning scales and shapes serves the same purpose. Offloading the cognitive process and focus on other things like rhythm, interpretation, articulation, etc., etc. And just play a bunch of notes that is coherent together as a group without needing to know the breakdown. So are we also going to accuse accordion players of cheating because they are playing chords with just one button on the left hand? That doesn't seem really fair. And now looking at the guitar itself. So one of the quotes that was picked up, let's say to back up Cory Wong, was other instrument learners have to go through learning all the notes before they can even play. Which is partially true. You usually start learning a few notes, learn to play around these, and then expand. But okay, the general point is fair. And before you accuse me of being a lazy tab reading guitarist, I learned classical guitar as a child, then I learned the clarinet later. So I actually started learning the guitar by learning each note on the guitar, albeit up to a certain fret, and then I learned a different instrument. And then when I started with electric guitars and chords, my first impulse was to use this knowledge of the fretboard to build up my own chords, knowing the theory and the intervals going into it. And then I sort of stumbled upon the same typical bar chords that everyone knows, and learned that you could just slide them along. And then later, looking at charts, I learned, oh yeah, I can add in a ninths or sevenths this and that way. And then moving into chord shapes. And I could do the same thing on the piano as well. Like I learned every single scale, the typical major and minor modes, and it took a lot of practice. But it's not a problem of not wanting to do it. I wanna be clear on that. So yeah, I went through some of the hoops, let's say, but somehow for guitar, I never really found it was useful to stick up with that method. And I will again try to explain my point. And going back to, okay, when you have to learn another instrument, you have to learn every single note. Well, the thing is that for most if we exclude guitar-like instruments and violins and cellos, there is typically just one way to play each note, and sometimes also some alternate ways to play the same note, like alternate fingerings, but they have a specific purpose. It's usually because the standard fingering is kind of awkward in the string of note that you want to play, so you have to use an alternative method. And sometimes it's just as good as the standard method, but sometimes it sacrifices a little bit of accuracy and tuning or timbre. So, okay, it's a whole other thing, but the main message here is there is not like 6 different ways to play the same note on most other instruments. Even if I talk back again about violins, well, technically there is 4 positions, maybe some octave, but then that applies also to guitar, etc., etc. So it doesn't really make sense to compare guitar to other instruments on that aspect. Because the guitar comes with the freedom to play the same note. It's a constraint that is lifted up. And I think that's the key element here. We can do more with the guitar than we can do with other instruments. Again, there are also other instruments that function the same way as the guitar, but let's break it down like that. And where I think is more important is that the guitar makes you think in terms of intervals rather than absolute pitches. And that is really a powerful idea. I think it's much more important to know which positions give you which intervals rather than knowing exactly which notes you are playing at all times. It's good to know sometimes to have reference points, to know where the root is. But then once you know that, and once you have the information about relative pitch, you can do a lot more than just knowing by heart all the positions. Root. 5th. 5th below. 4th. 4th below. Minor 3rd. Major 3rd. Minor 6th below. Scale. And back to the chords, I say it's not important to know which notes you are playing, but knowing which intervals you are stacking, that's the useful thing. And as I said before, where is the root in the shape, where is the 5th, the 3rd, etc. That's the important point. That is what makes the guitar so powerful for me in terms of composition and improvisation compared to other instruments. And not using that, refusing to using that, I think, is just hindering yourself. In this sequence of chords, I'll just think in terms of minor, major, and sus4. I don't think for each degree, what is the minor 3rd, the major 3rd, or the 4th. I just play them. And then if we're not playing chords, but playing melodies, again, it's important to know which interval a specific move up or down the frets on the higher or lower string creates. And after all, would you ask a singer who does not have perfect pitch, that is, to sing an F sharp at the top of their head? That would not really be fair. But if you ask them to sing a minor triad, do, mi, sol, mi, do, that would be a much more reasonable demand. And that to me is what makes the guitar such an amazing instrument. You can let go of the thought process of which note is which and just go for feelings. And okay, we are going to open the big Pandora's box of playing with feel. No, that's not what it's about. It's all about intervals. Relative pitch is the name of the game, not absolute note or pitch. Here I'm not thinking about specific notes, I'm thinking about modes, switching between a minor mode, a major mode, etc. Would I ask Cory Wong to play me the note that has a 587 Hz for a fundamental frequency? That would also not make sense. And in fact, a unified tuning system is by far the exception in the space and time of music history. And even today, many prodigies and virtuosos learned by playing by ear along records. And that is a skill just as precious as sight reading or thinking about which pitch you're playing. And I say that as someone who is used to relying on the score because of my training, and I struggle actually a lot to play from memory and just by ear. It's something I'm working on, it's something I'm learning, but those skills are complementary, and saying that you absolutely need to master one to be advanced, I don't think that's a great message to convey. And don't get me wrong, I also dislike the complacent musicians who refuse to learn theory. When I play, I use both the relative and the absolute thinking. There is for sure a place for each of them. It's the right tool for the right job kind of situation. And I think it's really useful to learn the framework, to learn the theory, to learn the fretboard for many reasons. But to say that it is the be-all, end-all, that it is the criteria to decide who is a good musician or not, no, I don't like this elitism. I mean, if it means that I'm not an advanced guitarist for not being able to play instantly C notes everywhere on the fretboard, fine. I prefer being a composer anyway than a performer. But I think what Cory said in his video is just rage baiting people who have a different way to learn, and I just think that's not cool, and especially coming from guitar players for the previously mentioned reasons, because the whole point of the guitar is that you have all these extra possibilities that indeed on other instruments would take you a lot more effort, but then you can skip that step and focus more on interpretation and aiming for the right interval and aiming for the right feel. So from guitar players, I find it a bit of a rich criticism. I would even accept it a little more from someone playing another instrument, and like I said, still taking it with a big grain of salt. And then if we add the condescending tone of the video, sorry, that's just not cool. Here I simply run across some degrees of the minor scale, and it doesn't matter to me in which scale I am. I can execute the same movement starting from a different position and obtain the same effect. And finally, one of the things that you can do with guitar is alternate tunings, or in my case, extended range. In fact, I prefer extended range because I can still retain what I learned from classical guitar and just add on it. If I shift the entire tuning, it sometimes messes a bit with my mind because I play the 12th fret expecting an E, but no, it's the note of whatever tuning I'm in, and that's a bit inconvenient actually. And yeah, you have so the tunings where you shift you take the standard tuning and you just shift it, or you can drop a note, or you can go even further with open chord tunings, etc., etc. And I don't think people who use these tunings goes through the trouble of relearning the entire board. They just transpose things, I'm guessing. Otherwise, like I said, it is really a headache actually, and maybe not paying too much attention to the position of each pitch is a little easier in that regard. And these tunings that go lower typically, if you go higher you can, but you have to watch out for string tension issues. Those tunings that go lower, they are to explore a different kind of tones. That they excite the distortion, they excite also our ears in different ways, and being able to not being too stuck to the framework and more think about it in terms of tone and in terms of registers, I think is maybe more important. And even if we are not talking about down tuning, also focusing on how the guitars sound in different areas. You can see I played roughly the same notes, and you can hear the attack and the timbre is not exactly the same. And I think being aware of that is more important than thinking, is this a B, is this a D? Again, maybe I think too much like a composer or a performer, but I think it's not wrong to try to know it, but it's not the highest priority, and it's certainly not what makes you good or advanced, in my opinion.